Hello, my name is Thomas, and thank you very much for downloading this episode of British Culture, Albion Never Dies. Today, I am joined by Caine, normally based in Fuzhou, but on a recent trip to Derby. He previously joined me for a deep dive into tea, a deep dive into ink, British tattoo culture, British men's wardrobes, Christmas, plus several discussions on British culture from an expat perspective. He also has a YouTube channel called Videos by Caine, and today he reveals what new projects he has coming up there. The link to his YouTube channel is in the show notes. Today, we're talking about St. George's Day, we talk about the history, we talk about the significance, and Caine gives you ways you could celebrate the day. We do mention the date, 17 minutes in. I won't spoil when that is. So please do enjoy this shallow dive into St. George's Day. Okay, Caine, thank you very, very much for joining me again.
Thanks for having me yet again, and we're filming this in a really nice place, right? It's not the normal way we filmed it in the past, stuck in our bedrooms over Skype. We're actually face to face and sat by a beautiful river on a really nice day, having a coffee and a tea.
Yeah, it's very nice, and we're coming up to St. George's Day.
Yeah, that is the topic of today's conversation, St. George's Day. For the listeners who aren't aware, St. George is the patron saint of England, and St. George's Day is the sort of de facto national day of England, because we don't have any de jure national day, and interestingly we don't have any national day for actually the country of the UK, or the sovereign nation state of the UK. We have national days for the various non-sovereign entities that make up the UK, but not the actual country itself.
So the nations, England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and the reason for that is we're one of the few countries in the world actually that don't have a national day, and it's of course because unlike many countries, we don't have a single defining moment which we can say is the birth of our country, right? We don't have, as the Americans do, the War of Independence, the Declaration of Independence, or as other countries
don't have Independence Days, we give them.
Yeah, people get Independence Days as a result of the British rather than the other way around. But we do have national days, or something like national days, 4 of them in fact, so yeah, that's cool.
St. David's Day, St. Andrew's.
Yeah, and actually that's something that before we get going with the history of this and all that kind of stuff, I wanted to touch on is every year about this sort of time, Twitter in particular, social media in general, but also articles in the newspaper, they all come alive with telling everybody St. George wasn't English, he didn't even come to England. And yeah, of course, that's absolutely true. I would be surprised if anybody didn't know that, to be honest. Yes. But nevertheless, it's something that people really feel the need to
St. Patrick wasn't born in
shout
Ireland.
About. Well, that's the point I wanted to make. That what I find a little bit unusual about this is that yes, St. George wasn't English, and he certainly didn't come to England as far as we know, and I don't think anybody's suggesting that he ever did. But what I wonder is, what's the point when people say that, or what is it about that they find unusual? Because as you pointed out, right, within the UK we have 4 patron saints, one for each of the constituent nations of the country, right?
Yeah.
Of those 4, only one of them is actually from the country which now has him as the patron saint, which is St. David, who was from Wales. St. Andrew, who is the patron saint of Scotland, of course, was from what is today, he was from Galilee, right, and he never came to Scotland. There's no suggestion that he came to Scotland. St. Patrick, the patron saint of both Northern and the Republic of Ireland, was British. He was born in, of course, the UK didn't exist at that time, England didn't exist, but nevertheless, he was born on the island of Great Britain in what is today Cumbria, and then he went to the island of Ireland. So of the 4 patron saints in the UK, St. George is just one of the majority.
And we can even extend that further to American listeners that, Simon Bolivar was not Bolivian.
Yeah. And exactly, the UK isn't really exceptional in this regard. It's not that the UK is, choosing these saints who have no actual relation to the country in terms of the fact that they weren't born there and didn't visit there. This seems to be, although I haven't ran the numbers, but this seems to be the rule across the world rather than the exception. So the patron saint of Belgium, for example, is St. Joseph, who of course never went to Belgium, and this patron saints of many countries around the world have no actual connection with that country. One of the most popular patron saints in South America is St. Mary, and of course St. Mary never went to the Americas. I mean, the continent wasn't known about at that time, right? So yeah, I kind of wonder, what is the point when people start shouting, oh, he wasn't even English? And again, if you're under the impression that it's such an amazing thing that everybody needs to know about, well, how come we don't hear St. Andrew wasn't Scottish, St. Patrick wasn't Irish? So yes, listeners, he wasn't English, he never came to England, he in fact was, like many other patron saints around the world, from a place unrelated to the place where he is now the patron saint. It's not unusual, it seems to be the rule, not the exception. So if you see on Twitter somebody saying this, or on social media, please send them this podcast and also ask them if they can explain what their meaning is behind their statement, because I also don't really understand what the idea is. Like when you say to somebody like, oh, he wasn't English, okay, and is there a follow-up to this? I mean, it's certainly not news to me, and I don't think it's news to anybody in England that St. George wasn't English.
It seems to be that we value, so it's not that he came from here, it's that we here value him.
Yeah, exactly. And as I was saying that, having a patron saint who's not from your country appears to be the rule globally rather than the exception. St. George himself is the patron saint of many countries: Georgia, Belize, Ethiopia, Latvia, Moldova, along with cities and regions, so Catalonia in Spain, Moscow in Russia. He never went to any of these places. I wonder if when Latvians are celebrating St. George's Day, do people shout at them, "He wasn't Latvian"? It just, the whole thing seems a bit unusual to me. It seems kind of very much beside the point. It certainly isn't news, but just to be clear, yes, he wasn't English, nor was he Georgian, nor was he Moldovan, nor was he Catalonian. I think that's not really relevant to any discussion about St. George's Day or St. George himself.
No, just to clue everybody in, I have done a grand total of no research on this, but naturally, due to my previous topic area, I have to ask, so was he Turkish?
That's an interesting question, because of course one of the next things that you'll sometimes see a follow-up to the he wasn't even English was, I've variously seen he was a Syrian refugee, he was Turkish. I think the problem is we are talking about modern geopolitical entities which just didn't exist and couldn't have been imagined at the time when St. George lived. So questions like, was he Turkish, was he Syrian, etc.
It's a bit like, we can Google him, but he wasn't even on Google when he...
Exactly, yeah. It's kind of like those things. What we can say is he was born in Cappadocia, which is in modern day Turkey. Right? We can say that. We know he was born to Greek parents, and by Greek parents we mean Greek speakers. Who would have traced their family history back to the various islands which, make up the Greek state. So we can say that he was a Greek speaker born in Cappadocia, which is in modern-day Turkey. The claim of him being Syrian usually goes to the fact that he was born in the Roman province of Syria Palestina. But again, to claim that makes him Syrian is, I think, a bit of a misrepresentation. The main thing is when we're dealing with these kinds of things, we're talking most of the time about a time and place in history when geopolitically the world was completely different to what it is today, and the people of those regions most likely didn't refer to themselves, well, almost certainly didn't refer to themselves as what we refer to them as today. So for example, when I said that St. Patrick was British, well, the concept of Britain in that sense as a sort of nationality or an identity didn't really exist. He almost certainly wouldn't have called himself British, certainly wouldn't have called himself English, because England didn't exist, although he's born in what is today England. Likewise, how St. George would have referred to himself, we can only speculate. What we do know is he was born in Cappadocia, which is modern day Turkey, and we know that he was born to Greek-speaking parents. I would probably say he was Greek. I mean, what would you refer to him as?
I have to refer to him as Turkish, but that's,
if there's any...
a greater reflection on me than the...
Yeah, if there's anybody new to the podcast, Thomas spent many of his formative years in the Turkish Republic of Cyprus, so he has a strong affinity
St.
to
George
Turkey.
is Turkish, and Santa Claus is Turkish, and it's just the way it goes, I accept my own bias.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, and again, I don't think it's necessarily wrong. I would say he was Greek.
Fair enough.
Because we're talking about a time when people's identities, or see, it's hard to say. What we think we know about how people may have chosen to identify as was based strongly upon language. This was a time of linguistic diversity, and so a lot of people would have associated with their linguistic group, so Greek speakers as opposed to some other speakers. Also, of course, religion was a very important thing, especially in this part of the Roman Empire, which was religiously diverse. And what we know is he was a Greek-speaking Christian. I would probably refer to him as Greek. I don't think it's that important, to be honest, though. Other than if you're sort of the kind of person who researches that kind of thing. But we can move on to, though, what do we know about him? And of course, we're talking now about an extremely long time ago. So the fact of the matter is there isn't a lot we know about him. There are lots of legends around him, but in terms of what we can say with kind of certainty is very, very little. What we know is what I've already said. On top of that, we know that he achieved high rank in the Roman army, and this was in the time of the rule of Emperor Diocletian. So this is pre-Constantine, so of course the Roman Empire wasn't Christian, and the Roman Emperor was considered, a deity. He was essentially a god on earth. And that caused him and many other Christians at that time a lot of problems, because of course Christians only have, their faith is that they believe in, one god, and they can't of course worship any kind of other god, so they didn't worship the emperor, they didn't regard the emperor as a god. This of course caused a lot of problems. There was a lot of persecution. I'm sure we all know about this, throwing Christians to the lions and so on and so on. Some of that may have been exaggerated by films, but nevertheless Christians were persecuted pre-Constantine in the Roman Empire. And St. George, he achieved high rank in the Roman army. However, he was eventually executed for his refusal to recognise to basically renounce his faith and recognise the emperor as a god on earth. And that's all we can really say for sure. There are two sources that we have. One is Greek and one is Latin. They both tell more or less the same story, which is what I've just described. The Latin source is a lot more elaborate, though. It mentions that he was, tortured over a period of years. On top of being tortured, he was offered all kinds of riches and rewards if he would convert. He didn't. In the end, he was executed for his refusal to give up, to renounce his faith. And I say convert, renounce his faith in Christianity, or at least enough that he could recognise the emperor's deification. And it's that martyrdom that of course led him to be venerated and be made a saint by the church.
Indeed. It says in the Bible, to thine own self be true. And this is something he did under great pressure and duress.
Yes, certainly. And I mean, that's why he began to be venerated. We're talking of somebody here who, again, we don't exactly know what happened, but we know that he was killed. So he probably experienced some sort of torture, or at the very least pressure beside that, right, in captivity. And it would have been, I suppose, quite easy for him to even just lie and say, okay, I've renounced my faith. But of course he didn't, and that's why we still remember him to this day. Had he have renounced his faith, nobody would know who St. George was, right?
He was a soldier, he was a Christian, a Roman,
a Greek, a possibly Turkish, depending on your interpretation. And you've probably heard the story, or at least you have some idea about the story of George and the Dragon.
Yes.
I'm wondering how that fits into all of this, because in everything I just said, I didn't mention any dragons being killed. Well, obviously that is a myth, that's a legend. Dragons didn't really roam the earth, and it's actually considerably later than the historical part of his life. So it's not until many centuries later that we start to learn about this myth of George and the Dragon. So if you're not familiar with the myth, basically the story goes that there was a city, usually it's considered to be a city in Libya. This city was terrorized by a dragon, and the dragon demanded tribute of livestock on a daily basis. So every single day the city people would bring sheep, cows, etc. Eventually they ran out of livestock, so it was decided that the dragon would be willing to accept one human sacrifice a year, and the human sacrifice would be chosen by lottery. So there'd be a lottery, and whoever drew the unlucky number would be the one that got sent to the dragon. This was apparently all fine for a while, until a popular princess drew the lot. And this became very, very unpopular. However, they did, honour the system, and she was sent to the dragon to be eaten by him. St. George just so happened to be riding along at the same time, saw what was going on, saw a damsel in distress, of course, ran to her saviour. He made the sign of the cross, he speared the dragon. After he did that, he asked for the princess to give him her belt, and then he used the belt as a lead. So, he sort of made the dragon into a pet. He pulled it back to the city, and he told the city inhabitants that he would kill the dragon and end, his reign of terror if they all agreed to convert to Christianity. They all converted, he killed the dragon, everybody lived happily ever after, and that's the story. That story, the story as we know it in the Western world, comes almost exclusively from a book called The Golden Legend, which is a list of biographies of saints, and that's from the 12th century. However, the legend actually is probably considerably older than that. There are legends that are very, very similar, but attributed to other saints. So it seems that this was kind of a legend known, in Europe at the time, that some sort of saint, perhaps even before the saints, some sort of hero killed a dragon. It's most likely a very ancient tale.
Yeah.
It's a bit like it's kind of not exactly the hero's myth or the hero's journey, but it's probably a very ancient tale that many cultures had similar stories separately, but they've all come together, and it was around the 12th century that, it was in the 12th century that it got written down into this book, The Golden Legend, so it was probably prior to that it started to be attributed to St. George, and ever since we now know the story with St. George as the hero. But of course before that, as I say, there were other saints that it was attributed to, and there are probably other folk heroes before the saints that it was attributed to.
Okay.
And I mentioned earlier that he's the patron saint of many different countries, right? But of course this is a podcast about British culture, so we're going to be talking now about how he became the patron saint of England. And as with a lot of things with British and English history, there's no one definitive date when we can say on this day he was declared patron saint, because again, often that's how things happen in a country that's kind of old and has slowly evolved over time. So the first mention we have of St. George in England is in the 8th century, when the famous the Venerable Bede, he wrote a list of martyrs and he included St. George in that list. So that's the kind of very first mention we have of him in England. During the Crusades he became extremely popular as a military saint, so English crusaders venerated him. However, it certainly wasn't unique to English crusaders. He was popular with crusaders from all over Europe because of his being a soldier, right, and his commitment to the faith and so on meant that he was a very popular military saint at that time. However, what I think we can say, you'll sometimes hear and this isn't correct, but you'll sometimes hear it said that Richard the Lionheart made him the saint. That's not true in any meaningful sense, but what probably did happen was that returning crusaders came back from the Crusades and continued their veneration of this saint that they began to venerate during the Crusades, and that might have spread it.
So it's influential.
Yeah, it would have encouraged the spread of St. George veneration within England, right? And then I think we can really say one of the first important dates is when Edward III made St. George the patron saint of the Order of the Garter, which was in 1348. And for those who aren't familiar, the Order of the Garter is the most, it's the highest chivalric order.
Most noble.
Yeah, it's the most noble. It's the very top one that you can get. It still exists today. The Queen, of course, is the head of the Order of the Garter. Is that how you'd say it?
Limited numbers. So.
Yeah, it's a very limited number, so it's the most important chivalric order that we have in England, in the UK, and it was Edward III who made St. George the patron saint of that order. So I think that can be the very first day where we can say this is when St. George is starting to become very, very popular, or very important in England, being set aside from other saints. After that, in 1450, the church in England, obviously it wasn't the Church of England at that time, but the church in England made St. George's Day a double major feast day. So they sort of elevated the importance of this feast day, right, to a double major feast day. Oh, I don't think we mentioned it at the start of the episode. St. George's Day is the 23rd of April. Sorry, listeners. 23rd of April. We weren't trying to leave you, in suspense or anything.
But if you're listening on the 24th,
you can
then
still
it's a
celebrate.
Double feast day, so you're all right.
Exactly. Yeah. So, by the early 1400s, again, we see the St. George's Day becoming more popular. And I think we can probably say, if we wanted to choose a single date on which we would say that he became the patron saint of England, although this isn't really correct, like I said, it kind of evolved, but if you wanted to choose the single most important date, it would probably be 1552, which is during the English Reformation, when it was decided that all religious flags and banners would be abolished, except for the flag of St. George.
Okay.
So the flag of St. George became, the only flag that you could fly, or at least the only saint's flag, that you could fly. To give that some context, the Reformation, of course, was this conflict between Protestantism and Catholicism, and much of the iconography and symbology of Catholicism was regarded by Protestants as being idolatry, right? So there was a big move to get away from having statues of saints and all this kind of stuff. So abolishing saints' banners and saints' flags would have been part of that movement from Protestants and low church types in the Church of England to try and get rid of what they considered to be idolatry. However, they allowed for the continued use of the flag of St. George, and I think we can maybe start that then as the sort of official, well, not official, but the most important date after which it's fair to say that St. George is the patron saint.
And we're talking
England.
about factors leading to the importance of St. George's Day here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that would be, I would say, probably that one, and then also earlier when he was made the patron saint of the Order of the Garter. Those are probably the two very big ones, right? But being as the Reformation came after, we can say it's perhaps more important, right?
So just to be clear, from the time of St. George, we're talking over 1,000 years later.
Yeah, of course. And, he had to be canonized by the church, right? And then he began to be celebrated, and as we spoke about earlier, his importance grew following the Crusades and so on and so forth. But following that period in the Reformation, when it was decided only St. George's flag could be flown, or that was the only saint flag that could be flown, it's pretty much at that point which we can say, okay, he's now the patron saint of England. There is another important date there that I think at least influenced the recognition of St. George, which would be from the Shakespeare play Henry V, right, which was written in 1599, because we all know the famous line, "Follow your spirit, and upon this charge cry God for Harry, England, and St. George."
Yes.
And I think that line, has obviously travelled down the ages, and perhaps has solidified the relationship in people's minds between England and St. George, right?
It's amazing how formative those plays really have been for English culture.
Yeah, certainly. Well, yeah, I mean, we could, and perhaps one day we really should, talk about, Shakespeare and his influence on English culture, because it just permeates every aspect of our life, our language, the way that we recognise certain things, how we think about certain things is very heavily influenced by that. And yeah, that's really St. George's Day. So if you come to England, though, around April the 23rd, and you're not too familiar with the culture, perhaps you've never been to the country before, however you're from somewhere like the US maybe, or from China perhaps, you might be expecting, well, okay, this is Patron Saint Day of England, it's the sort of de facto national day of England, so I'm going to see great big celebrations, right? Everything's going to be brilliant, it's going to be lots of, decorations everywhere. Unfortunately not. It's actually not a particularly popular holiday compared to the other holidays that exist, in England. It's also not a national holiday. It's the only patron saint day which isn't a national holiday in the UK. St. Andrew's Day is a holiday in Scotland. St. David's Day is a holiday in Wales. St. Patrick's Day is a holiday in Northern Ireland. But St. George's Day is not a holiday in England. Yeah. There's a variety of reasons around that. Some of them I think are just quite organic. It was very popular. There was a time, we spoke about this during the podcast we did on Christmas, there was a time when St. George's Day was a bigger celebration than Christmas Day. So it was a very popular day, but it seemed to wane. It seemed to wane following the creation of the United Kingdom. Yeah. And as we spoke about on various podcasts before, this sort of the difference between British identity and English identity, and as we see a growth in British identity, I think we see a corresponding decline in English identity. Maybe I phrased that the wrong way. As we've seen a sort of growth in Britishness and the celebration of Britishness, we've seen a decline perhaps in the celebration of Englishness. Yeah. And as a result, there seems to have been a just sort of natural decline in the day being celebrated, and it just became less and less popular. There's been various attempts at revival. The first sort of attempt at revival was during the Victorian era. There's actually the creation of the I think it's called the Royal St. George's Society, and they were set up with the goal of reviving St. George's Day as a celebration. There was some success with that. However, with the World Wars, which again led to a great deal of unity within the country, right, and the flying of Union Jacks and so on and so forth, there again was a corresponding decline in a celebration of Englishness, because we were all united as Brits together. Nothing makes you unite like an external enemy, right? So of course, the world wars, and again, it just seemed to be a kind of natural decline, right? That it's been perhaps exacerbated in recent years by a sort of desire to... It's become quite uncool, I would say. It's become quite uncool, where, although there's been a revival of Scottish nationalism and Welsh nationalism, there hasn't been a corresponding revival of English nationalism. Or where it has happened, it's been considered just not... Off-piste. Not something that many people, or not something that certain people think should be done. However, that said, it's not all doom and gloom. There are definitely celebrations. I've celebrated it before in the UK. There will be parades and pageants around the country. Again, it's not like celebrating St. Patrick's Day in Ireland.
Right?
Yeah, that's something. It is very local. It's locally organised. It's often, you'll find in smaller villages, in towns, a lot more will be done for it. Churches will have celebrations, of course. If they're not already doing so, they'll be flying the St. George's flag, and people will be attending, ceremonies and so on. But also you have in Nottingham, for example, where I used to live before moving to China. Nottingham had a St. George's Day parade, and they would have a guy on a horse who would reenact stabbing a dragon and all that kind of stuff. I believe London in recent years, although I haven't looked into this, so do so yourself, listeners, if you're interested, but I believe London does now have St. George's Day like official celebrations. If they don't, though, as I say, there are many other cities, certainly villages and towns that definitely do. You said when you were a child, you went to a St. George's Day parade, is that correct?
So I took part. I think I was a Boy Scout, and so I took part in a big parade. But it was a big parade in a very, very small town.
Yeah, exactly.
So it was a very local thing.
And St. George is actually the patron saint of Scouts, which would be another one of the reasons why you celebrated that day. But if you are listening to this and you do want to celebrate, firstly, if you're in the UK, just go online. There's a very good chance that there is something happening locally within your area. Like I said, it's not like celebrating St. Patrick's Day in Ireland, but there are across the country various celebrations. But if there doesn't have to be one near you, or if you're listening to this in America or somewhere else and you want to celebrate, I've got some ideas for you. So traditionally, one of the big things to do to celebrate this day was to go and watch folk plays where they would reenact the George and the Dragon story. And I think the St. George's Day Parade are kind of a modern day successor to that. So if you were outside the UK, you can find those on YouTube. If you just Google St. George's Day Parade or St. George's Day Play, you could watch one of those. If you're looking for something a bit more fun, I would say, and this isn't based on any kind of tradition or anything, this would be my idea of how you could celebrate. So let's imagine you didn't have to go to work. I'd say wake up and make yourself a full English breakfast. That should be the first thing you should do. If you want to know more about full English breakfasts, we discussed it on the podcast episode. What was the title, Thomas?
I think it was the UK, not just London.
Yeah, where the actual podcast episode was about travelling to different places around the UK outside of the most popular tourist places, and we discussed quite extensively a full English breakfast on that podcast, so please go listen to that episode. Or, if you can't be bothered to do that, just Google full English breakfast, you'll find plenty of information. Make yourself a full English breakfast. I'd say do that in the morning. And then following your nice breakfast, now if you've relaxed a little bit, I would say enjoy some great English literature. The 23rd of April, St. George's Day, also happens to be the birthday of William Shakespeare. So you might want to open up some Shakespeare.
And his death day.
His birthday and death day?
Yeah, he died on his birthday.
Did he? Oh, that's unfortunate, isn't it? Well, yeah.
But very neat.
Yeah.
Exactly how old he was.
Yeah, so you could read a bit of Shakespeare, or really, English literature. Obviously, there is so much and so many things that you could delve into. So I would say that would be a good thing to do, is just read a bit of literature, whoever your favourite English author is, or some poetry or something like that. Later in the evening, I'd say why not have a big party? So decorate your house. Of course, red and white is the colours of the George's Cross. It's a red cross on a white background. So you could ask your guests to wear red and white clothes, in the way that you might ask people to wear green for St. Patrick's Day, for example. You decorate your house with St. George's flags. Serve tea and biscuits. For music, you're absolutely spoiled because, of course, England has given a great deal to the world in terms of musical culture, right? If you're a pop fan, you could listen to Phil Collins or the Spice Girls, perhaps, or pop rock, you could listen to Oasis.
The Beatles were well served.
Oh yeah, if you want something that everybody can agree is good, then the Beatles. If you prefer classical music, I would say Edward Elgar would probably be a very good choice.
And there's a special episode, E is for Elgar, if you scroll back.
Yeah, or if not Elgar, Vaughan Williams would be a great choice. But yeah, that would be my suggestion. If you want something a little bit harder, then tea and biscuits. If your guests like to get a bit, they like to relax and get a little bit tipsy, then a gin and tonic, I would say, would be a good choice, or Pimm's.
Yeah.
Especially at this time of the year, April, the weather's starting to get nice and warm. It's a good time for Pimm's.
It is Pimm's o'clock.
Exactly. Or if you can get your hands on it, again, depending on where you are in the world, some good English ale. And then, at the end of the day, I imagine that you'll be full and tired, and have a nice sleep, and that will be your St. George's Day.
It sounds fantastic, and it's very organic, as you say, so it's not like, say, American states have their state flag, their state rock, their state bird.
Yeah.
But because it's organically developed over more than 1,000 years, it is very localized, right?
Yeah.
The celebration I went to it's a village. The village does it the way the village has always done it.
Yeah, exactly, and so you can keep that tradition alive by developing perhaps some kind of unique way that you like to celebrate it. I actually celebrated probably the biggest St. George's Day celebration, not the biggest, that's not the right way of saying it, the most memorable St. George's Day celebration I've been to, and I've been to a few, by the way, because I celebrated it in Nottingham every year for about 3 years. So, say Nottingham, they have the parade, but also a lot of the pubs in Nottingham. There's a lot of very old traditional pubs in Nottingham, and a lot of them will decorate and have celebrations. But probably the most memorable St. George's Day celebration I've ever had was actually in Fuzhou, China, where obviously the listeners will know I've been living. And I organised it myself, and it's probably the most multicultural St. George's Day you could possibly imagine. It was hosted in a Dutch restaurant, so my friend was from Holland and he had a Dutch restaurant in Fuzhou. So it was hosted in this Dutch restaurant. It was attended by obviously lots of Chinese people, but also lots of other expats from all over the world. In fact, I think there were probably only about 3 English people there. So it was it was a very fun experience, because I think besides me and the other English people, nobody had ever heard of it before. But suddenly, we've got George's crosses up everywhere, we're playing Oasis and the Beatles, people are drinking gin and tonics, and it was a really, really fun day. Everybody enjoyed it, I certainly enjoyed it. So, if St. George's Day can be celebrated in Fuzhou, China, then it can be celebrated wherever you're listening to this right now.
Our patron saint and a global festival.
Exactly. And I mean, that's the thing, right? St. George, of course, is a truly international saint.
Yeah.
So, don't feel limited. Oh, and I know a lot of your listeners are from Canada, is that correct?
Yes, sure.
He's the patron saint of one Canadian province. Canadians, please message in and tell us, because I forget, but I think it's... Is it Newfoundland? Maybe he's the patron saint of? Sorry, he's
been recorded. We will find out.
Yeah, he's the patron saint of one of those Atlantic coast provinces. So if you happen to be on one of those provinces, then you have even more reason. On top of the fact that you just like to, celebrate and enjoy English culture, you have even more reason to celebrate.
Okay, then Caine, thank you very much for giving us a shallow dive into St. George.
Yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I really would encourage your listeners to celebrate, because look, there's any excuse for a party is a good one, right?
Absolutely.
And also, I'd like to shamelessly plug some of my own content here. Some of the regular listeners might know I do have a YouTube channel where I make videos about Chinese culture, and those videos are pretty diverse. I've got videos about Chinese folk religion, I've got videos about modern Chinese architecture, about the tattoo scene in Fuzhou, I've got videos about Chinese tea. So if you are at all interested in any aspect of Chinese culture, I would encourage you to check out my YouTube channel. It's just Videos by Caine. Caine is C-A-I-N-E. If you just type Videos by Caine into YouTube, it will be the first result. If you're listening to this and you're thinking, I've already checked out Caine, I've watched all your videos, they're amazing, well, thank you very much for the positive feedback. However, I'm actually currently working on a new series of videos, something I've been thinking about for quite some time, but I've just never had the time to get around to it. I will give you a spoiler. It's going to be the history of Christianity in Imperial China. So I'm going to make a series of videos. My guess is it will probably be 3 videos, it might be 4, but my goal is to give a comprehensive but digestible overview of the history of Christianity from its first recorded instance in the country during the Tang Dynasty all the way up to the end of the imperial era. If that sounds like the kind of thing you're interested in, you go to my YouTube channel. If you subscribe, then as soon as it's uploaded, you'll be able to listen to it. And of course, watch it. Depending on when you're listening to this podcast, it may already be up.
Thank you very much. And yes, Videos by Caine, very easy to find, and even easier because there's a link in the show notes. You just go straight to it, and it's good stuff coming up.
All right. Well, thanks very much for having me again, Tom, and hopefully I'll be back soon.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening to that. And yes, the link to Videos by Caine is in the show notes. And yes, St. George is the patron saint of Newfoundland. Again, thank you very much for listening.